Thank you very much, Anna, and your wonderful panelists. Appreciate. As has been mentioned, in this age of mis and disinformation that has been weaponized to undermine democracy, it's time to discuss media, truth, and trust in a digital age. Here virtually to provide keynote remarks is Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft.
Well, thank you, Jean. It's a pleasure to join all of you in Copenhagen, even if I'm halfway around the world at the moment in Microsoft's campus just east of Seattle in the United States. And as we think about the role of media, I actually want to start by building on the last panel, which I had the opportunity to watch on YouTube as I was sitting in my office early this morning and just following your conversation. And I want to start actually with a phrase that Vice President Jourova used. She said, "The age of innocence is over." I think that frames things very powerfully. And as we think about media, as we think about trust, I actually want to connect it to the full range of what you all are talking about today and tomorrow in Copenhagen, and what, frankly, we're learning from the war in Ukraine. Because I think what we're seeing is a set of issues that are very connected together. And perhaps one of the most important things we're learning is that we need to think about it all together. Certainly since February, we've all been living in a time that's not the time we anticipated 2022 would be. And as we as a company have been working on the ground in Ukraine and across the region, I think we've been seeing several things and learning several things. And I just wanted to highlight some of these for you today. We provided as a company $237 million of financial and technical assistance. And I think it's given us not just an opportunity to see more, but frankly, to learn more. The first thing that really jumps out to me is something that was perhaps obvious when the year began, but we're seeing it in bold relief. Digital infrastructure is at the heart of everything in every democratic society, whether we're talking about a time of war or peace. You know, interestingly, importantly, one of the first cruise missiles fired by the Russian military was targeting the Ukrainian government's data center. The Russians understood that if you could take out the digital infrastructure of Ukraine, you could stop the government from operating. Well, the good news is in the week or two before, we had been working with what I think are real cyber heroes in Ukraine and the Ukrainian government to literally move the government to the cloud, to move 16 out of 17 Ukrainian ministries to the cloud, not to a different data center in Ukraine, but to disperse their operations across the public cloud across Europe. And that's made all the difference in helping to enable the government to continue what it needs to do, as well as the economy in Ukraine as a whole. Now, the second thing I think we're learning is what it takes to defend a country in a time of war. And there's powerful lessons, I think, for countries at peace as well. We have seen an unprecedented and just ferocious series of cyber attacks, destructive attacks aimed at Ukraine, launched by the Russian military. Interestingly, the first shots fired in this war were not by cruise missiles or artillery shells. They were cyber weapons. And the first weapon was one called Foxblade, and it wasn't fired on the 24th. It was fired 12 hours earlier on the 23rd. And interestingly, I think it was not first seen in Ukraine. It was actually first seen across the street on our campus where I'm standing right now at the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. And that just captures how much the nature of warfare and times of peace have changed. Geographic boundaries, distance has been erased. Weapons move at the speed of light. Now, the good news, I think, is so far, defense has proven stronger than offense when it comes to these destructive cyber attacks. Despite seeing hundreds of waves of these attacks in Ukraine, we've been able to use the technology we've been building and deploying over the last 5 years, including in Ukraine itself, to defend Ukraine itself. But there's a huge amount of ongoing innovation and learning that we're going to need to continue to pursue. Now, the third thing that I think has been emerging from this war is what it takes to protect people. Now, part of this is the protection of people who are civilians in a war-torn region, refugees who need to be protected, who need to flee. But one of the sobering things to me is I was literally listening to the prior panel and reading the report that had come in overnight in terms of the most recent cyber attacks that we're seeing, is that continuing Russian focus on humanitarian organizations and not just destructive attacks, but new efforts to penetrate their networks and not only do it in Ukraine itself, but to do it in Poland and other countries nearby. And I think that then takes me to what is in effect the topic that you all are going to be talking about for the next hour or so. It's what Michael Chertoff was talking about. An age-old problem, going back literally to the age of the Roman Empire, information operations, and specifically foreign information operations aimed at countries, especially democracies, not just in times of war, but in times of peace. As Michael said, we're seeing this in more varied ways than before. I think we're seeing these attacks in more sophisticated ways than we have before. And while I think the defense has been stronger than offense in some of the destructive malware attacks launched at the government and the economy in Ukraine, I don't think the same thing can be said for the combating of Russian disinformation attacks on not just Ukraine, but literally democracies around the world. What we're seeing is a coordinated attack aimed at undermining trust in democracies. And part of it is based on politics. Part of it is based on public health. As Michael was noting, we've seen a surge over the last year when we look at propaganda coming from Russia focused on something like vaccines and COVID. And I think the fundamental question that you all have such an important opportunity to address is, what do we do? I think so much of the leadership and the great lessons that can be learned and applied around the world come from the very place where you all are meeting this afternoon, from Copenhagen. When I look at the Copenhagen Pledge and the leadership of the Danish government, or I look at the examples from the countries in Northern Europe, I think, frankly, we need to talk more about what you all are doing and how we spread this around the world. We are going to need to do more, I think, to get better at detecting foreign disinformation attacks, the same way that we can, through our Threat Intelligence Center, detect in real time destructive cyber attacks. We're focused on developing that capability, but the world is not yet where it needs to be. I think we then need to invest more in the defense, the resilience of society from these kinds of information attacks. And here I think some of the best examples in the world come from work that has been going on for decades in places like Finland and Sweden, countries that learned the lessons of World War II, that have lived their entire lives, for everybody who's alive today next door to Russia or the Soviet Union, and have built media literacy into the society in a way that a country, frankly, like the United States has not. We are going to need to, I think, invest more in traditional media. Journalism is at the heart of democracy. And I think it's good that we're seeing the kinds of laws that, frankly, are putting more pressure on all of us, including those of us at Microsoft, to think more and do more. I think we're going to need to come together and find new ways to disrupt these disinformation attacks. When I look at what we've been able to do to disrupt cyber attacks in Ukraine in real time, we have the opportunity to develop that capability when we're thinking about disinformation. And it's going to take more tech companies leaning in. I think it's good that Meta is there today, that Google is there tomorrow. We are all going to need to work together, and we're going to need to raise our game and accept a higher level of responsibility, not just voluntarily, but I think under the role and the rule of law. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. When you really look at the end of the age of innocence, I think we should think back to what the world learned from World War II. More than 50 million civilians died. And when that war ended, people came together, every government in the world came together in Geneva to embrace the Geneva Convention and a fundamental principle that governments have a responsibility, not just morally, but legally, to protect civilians in times of war, to protect civilians, we believe, in times of peace. And we need to recognize that that isn't just from kinetic weapons. It's from destructive cyber attacks. It's from disinformation attacks as well. And I think at the heart of what you all have the opportunity to advance, what you'll hear, I think, from former President Obama tomorrow, is that the multilateralism of the 20th century needs to continue, and we need to build on it with multi-stakeholderism today. And that's going to take more work by tech companies. It's going to take the great institutions in civil society. It's going to take governments and businesses in democracies around the world. But if we can learn together from what's happening, if we can stand together for these great principles, and if we can act together, I think there's a basis for hope. We need hope, because the coming months may be even harder than the first months of this year. But we do know that we've been, as a world, through even harder times before. And if we can build on what the generations before us accomplished and use that as our inspiration, then I think we have the opportunity to get ourselves not only through this time of crisis, but to build a stronger foundation in the future, starting in Copenhagen. So thank you very much.